Well, hello and welcome to Dig Deeper, a chance for us to explore further into what we talked about on Sunday. We are doing this, of course, in conversation with Dr. Stephen Backhouse, all the way from his shed at the bottom of his garden. And this view we have gotten used to by now. Those of you joining us on YouTube, of course, have gotten used to the comic books surrounded by fairy lights. And with Stephen Backhouse with his proper podcast kit with his headphones and his proper microphone, right. and I just try and do it as best I can.
But if we lose our internet connection again, this will all be for nothing. So we really need is Virgin Media to keep its end up.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I pays my monies, and I hope to get my internet. That's what was the problem last time we did this, was that the road was being dug up, but not today.
Powers and principalities, man. Powers and principalities.
Right. Exactly. These are the things we contend with. So we are going straight into Ephesians. We are Ephesians chapter 4, and we're going to begin at verse 17. Do you want to read or shall I read? What do you want to do?
Oh, can you read your one? Because I've got an odd translation. I'm genuinely interested in how your one comes out. So.
Absolutely. So I'm reading, as I usually do, from N.T. Wright's Kingdom translation, and we're going to begin at verse 17 and move to the end of the chapter. This is Paul writing to the church in Ephesus. So this is what I want to say. I am bearing witness to it in the Lord. You must no longer behave like the Gentiles, foolish-minded as they are. Their understanding is darkened. They're cut off from God's life because of their deep-seated ignorance, which springs from the fact that their hearts are hard. They have lost all moral sensitivity and have given themselves over to whatever takes their fancy. They go off greedily after every kind of uncleanness. But that's not how you learn the King. If indeed you did hear about him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth about Jesus himself. That teaching stressed that you should take off your former lifestyle, the old humanity. That way of life is decaying as a result of deceitful lusts. Instead, you must be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And you must put on the new humanity, which is being created the way God intended it, displaying justice and genuine holiness. Put away lies then. Each of you speak the truth with your neighbor, because we are members of one another. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on you while you're angry, and don't leave any loophole for the devil. The thief shouldn't steal any longer, but should rather get on with some honest manual work so as to be able to share with people in need. Don't let any unwholesome words escape your lips. Instead, say whatever is good and will be useful in building people up so that you will give grace to those who listen. And don't disappoint God's Holy Spirit, the Spirit who put God's mark on you to identify you on the day of freedom. All bitterness and rage and all anger and yelling and all blasphemy, put it away from you with all wickedness. Instead, be kind to one another. Cherish tender feelings for each other. Forgive one another, just as God forgave you in the King.
So you preached on this, did you? You had to jump in and preach on this.
Yeah.
So how did you talk about anger in this time of war right now?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, what I found in reading around this passage, and I found John Stott's commentary helpful on this, but is to distinguish between kind of what would be classically termed as righteous anger and sinful anger, because it's clear from the passage that Paul talks about here is that what he's not saying is do not be angry.
Right.
What he's saying is in your anger, do not sin.
Right.
And so there does seem to be an expectation that you will be angry. And there is an expectation that some of that anger is good. You just need to make sure you're not going to sin when you do it. It's the sinning.
What defines sin then?
Well, I think what I brought it back to was a sense in which, in the way that I would try and define sin in the first place, which is around something that is self-serving. So for me, an anger that is based on or is rooted in my lack of getting what I want, or me feeling personally affronted, or me feeling that my ego has been damaged, or something about me, where my sense of who I am has been injured in some way, and there's sin is kind of our hearts turned inward on themselves. It's that kind of is my visceral response to having my sense of self being damaged, as it were. That's kind of how I kind of positioned it, versus the kind of anger that I think, well, you framed it at the beginning of the question, the kind of anger where we look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, and there should be an anger. There should be an anger, I think, towards what is happening, the injustice that others are experiencing. I am personally not affronted by what is happening in Ukraine. It's not affecting my life directly, other than I'm seeing a slight rise in gas prices, and a few kind of economic implications. But broadly speaking, my life is still as it was. My sense of who I am is still as it was. So actually, there seems to be a justice issue about being angry at the evil that we see, the injustice of Putin's actions.
To not get angry is a form of sin. So
well, that's where funny enough, I said that. I said, in some ways, apathy in the face of that.
Right. So
I would say borders on sinfulness.
Because it's self-centeredness is at the root of both of them. So you're just taking care of yourself. That either leads to a kind of a selfish anger, or it leads to a selfish apathy.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Right.
Because I'm not, other than, like I said, a rise in gas prices, my personal life is not dramatically impacted by what's happening in Ukraine. And I think there's with the 24/7 news cycle, we are numbed now. Even it's only a month in, we're numbed to images of Mariupol being 80% destroyed. And that women and children hiding in a theater, 400 of them. I think that was the number I read. 400 of them are likely to have been killed. We don't know what to do with these kind of numbers, and so we numb ourselves, and that in and of itself, I think, becomes a so I'll be interested to see what you think about this. So
I can't help notice the I find myself, I just can't help notice the lack of concern for other types of people who are also under war conditions. So the complete lack of concern for Syrians or Yemeni or Congolese, and there's like active war zones. And in fact, some of them, like the ones in the Yemen, British people have more actual, like it was Britain that was selling the bombs to the Saudis who are dropping the bombs on the Yemenis. Like we're more involved in that violence and that misery, but we care less. And I can't help but notice the outpouring of affection for one type of refugee and not for another. Right. And that's not to say that the Ukrainians aren't also suffering. It's just to say, oh, this is interesting. This holds a mirror up.
Yeah.
And I've explicitly seen people say, oh, we should welcome Ukrainians because they're white Christians. And so the Christian nationalism even is coming up. It's front and center, even in the middle of compassion. And so I find that I have a hard time not noticing that, like that lack of concern. But then I also want to not be judgmental, because it's not like I'm doing all I can.
Right.
Yemeni and the Congolese. Like it's this kind of time where I am actually suspicious of righteous anger. So I'll tell you that up front. I'm actually suspicious of it. I feel like it's a lie. It's interesting here that Paul is talking about do not lie. He starts his whole thing by do not lie. And I find it interesting that righteous anger itself is a major form of self-deception, because we get to be right about something, and we get to be righteously angry about something, and it masks a whole lot of other things that we're forgetting about, or it covers over a multitude of sins, right? It's like, well,
But
I get
could
to be
you-
righteously angry about this, and it's clearly bad, so I get to do whatever it takes to fix this problem because I'm right
Yeah.
in my anger. When actually what we're probably doing is ignoring some other stuff, or we're exacerbating the issue in the first place, or in the
But
case of
one
war, we're
doesn't-
sinning. So we're
but
killing.
one
we're
doesn't negate the
disobeying
other, does
Jesus.
it? One doesn't negate the other. I guess what I'd
Yeah,
say
right.
is,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I would say it's, just because I may not feel righteous anger in what is happening in Yemen as an
right.
example,
Doesn't mean you shouldn't
mean
be righteous angry about Ukraine.
right. It feels to me like it's addition rather than subtraction.
But also it's also like, what does it do for us? Like, what does it lead to? Because if it's just, this is the whole problem with like, Instagram justice, where if you're just angry enough to share a post and then you feel like you've done something, when of course you haven't.
Change your logo to blue and white flag.
That kind of thing. And so then you're like, well, fine, I was righteously angry, but did I do anything with it? Like, is that a waste of
But
my anger?
Paul's qualification is that righteous anger, I think, doesn't then therefore lead to sin. So we've talked before about the turning the other cheek thing, right? So I think it's legitimate to be righteously angry at Putin.
Well, this is where I wanted to go. I'm glad you
without
brought up
that then
Sermon on
turning
the
into
Mount.
a sinful thing.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Sermon on the Mount, because this is what I wanted to talk about when I asked you to define sin. It's like, well, do you remember that Jesus actually talks about how to be angry without sinning in the Sermon on the Mount? I mean, he talks about it. And he talks about being angry at your brother and calling them a fool, like Raka, remember, the piece of shit. And so it's like, well, if you're going to be Christocentric, if we're going to define sin, not based on what Sigmund Freud thinks or Martin Luther or Augustine or whatever, or even the book of Genesis, what if we define sin based on what Jesus says about it? Well, he thinks that hating your brother is like murdering your brother, and that's the sin. Okay. So in your anger, do not do the thing that Jesus said not to do, which is to strike back, the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So that's interesting to me, that so much of our righteous anger directly leads to killing our enemies.
Right. And we
think we're justified.
But also
our anger is so righteous.
Right. But I think that's right. But what makes it righteous is not we can't allow the justification for the feeling to justify the action.
Right. But which is what we do all the time. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is where I wanted to point out, like, I'm reading this along with you, and I was thinking, wow, so many Christians hearing this right now think that they are on the inside and that Paul is talking about other people. And I just was looking at that and you're like, well, he basically is talking about, they are people, don't be like the Gentiles. They are people who lack all sense of right and wrong, who have turned themselves over to doing whatever feels good and practicing every sort of corruption with greed. And I'm just thinking, like, the Christian world I know has lost its moral compass. It's spinning wildly, and it just follows power and greed. I mean, that's what so many of our institutions and movements.
Well, on Sunday, Sunday, I spoke of this as being for us. Yeah. And in fact, one of my main challenges, I think, in terms of how we navigate this personal ethics, corporate ethics sphere, is that we take the words of Paul and indeed Jesus, and we apply them to the world. Yeah. Very ready. We're very ready to say, those people over there need to do this, and these people over there need to stop behaving like that, and how dare we pass a law that allows for this, and blah blah blah. And actually, what Paul is saying is, no, he's writing to the church. Yeah, I particularly like that. There's a bit that I pointed out on Sunday. He talks about the fact that he says, "Don't disappoint God's Holy Spirit," and we'll talk about that in a moment after the break. Yeah, but it says, all bitterness and rage, all anger and yelling. In my version, in the NIV, it says all anger and brawling. Oh, wow. And I just love, I love the fact that he's writing to the church. And there's literal brawls going on in the church. Yeah. And I'm like, guys, if you think that we have issues of unity right now, wait till Paul has to write a letter to us to say, stop brawling. But the point is he's writing to the church. He's writing to those of us that have signed up to the way of Jesus. Yeah. And so this isn't for my neighbor to my left or to my right.
No,
This
it's not a
isn't,
judge.
I
It's
shouldn't
not a
be
judgment.
imposing a moral framework
No,
on people
no.
that have not signed up to the way of Jesus. That's not what this is about. It's about us as the
Yeah,
church.
yeah, and it's interesting that he looks at things like don't lie, get rid of lying, tell
Yeah.
the truth, like don't live. You know, it's I often talk about my favorite theologian, one of my favorite theologians, Stanley Hauerwas, who's this Texan theologian, and he says like one of the main. I know I've repeated this before on stuff, but like he just says one of the main sins, and he's specifically talking about evangelical Americans, but it applies to us too. Is sentimentalism. Like we're sort of sentimental, and we tell these rosy cheeked stories about the world and about ourselves and our place in it, and it's sentimental and it's a lie. It's just a lie. And we make ourselves the hero of these stories, and we put ourselves at the top of history's cultural development, and we say that we are this thing in the world, and we're not. We're the opposite. We're actually a lie. And he's like, just start telling the truth. And it's interesting that that's where Paul goes. His very first thing is just tell the truth. And then he talks about don't be angry without sinning. Don't let the sun set on your wrath. Like, again, that kind of idea of like, be reconciled as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Don't provoke an opportunity for the devil. And again, I remember again, like where Jesus talks about the devil, you know, oath telling, he says that comes from the devil. Like there's a few places where he talks about the devil specifically, and it's interesting that it comes up in those places. Thieves.
Well, isn't it interesting that he couches this all in truth telling, and in doing so is speaking truth to a congregation?
Yeah, right.
So he's saying don't lie, and by the way, I'm just going to unleash some truth bombs today. Like, guys, you need to deal with your lying, but also in the process of dealing with your lying, you need to be honest about some of the things that are going on in our congregation.
And he's probably quite angry. I mean, we know Pauline anger. Like we know that he gets angry in his own letters and stuff, right? So it's not like this kind of wimpy let everything slide kind of person, right? Like we know that there was anger in the early church. So I'm really interested, like, what does sin mean then? You know, how do you anger without wiping somebody off the face of the earth? How do you?
So what do you think? So do you have an answer to that?
Well,
what do you think it looks like?
The answer is going to come later, by the way. It's going to come in Ephesians 5. We're helping to set the tone here as a little taster for all those parts of the Bible that we wish our non-Christian friends didn't know about. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, submit to your wives. Masters, submit to your slaves. Slaves, submit. Like, we're going to get to the submission stuff soon. And actually, we're going to talk about it. It's been misused in history, but in Paul's use, this mutual submission is how we are angry without sinning, or it is how we form ourselves in a way that isn't like the Gentiles do it. Right. So it's mutual submission, because you talked about how for sin for you was self-assertion or selfishness, right? You assert yourself into the world at the expense of other people. Well, mutual submission,
and primarily at the expense of God, ultimately.
Yeah,
you're saying, I'm going to place myself.
And a life based on mutual submission is a life based on not my will, but yours be done.
Yeah.
Which is Paul's, and not just Paul, the early church's solution to the world run by the devil, which is the world of self-assertion, is a world run by the kingdom of Jesus, which is the world of not my will, but yours be done. And they called it submission, mutual submission. And that's really worth looking at. But we'll do it next week, but we're just setting the stage. This is going to be the solution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that seems appropriate to take a bit of a time out and a break. Go and get yourself a cup of coffee. If you'd like to, pause us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. There is so much to talk about. I feel like we've only just scraped the surface. We talked a bit about anger. We talked about truth-telling. But I'd love us to focus on this little verse, this throwaway verse. In verse 30, it says, "Do not disappoint the Holy Spirit." In the NIV that I preached from on Sunday, it said, "Do not grieve." I don't know what your translation says, Stephen.
Mine is very anemic. It says, "Do not make the Spirit of God unhappy." So this is why I wanted you to read yours, because I was like, my one's a bit too. I think my one is pulling some punches here. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I make my children unhappy regularly when I tell them they can't have chocolate or something. It feels like it conjures up images of just the Holy Spirit being grumpy in the corner because I haven't given him what he wants. But Yeah, so do not disappoint, do not grieve. I thought that was interesting emotive word the NIV chooses, do not
Well,
grieve the Holy Spirit.
we've talked about this before, haven't we? I mean, grieving the Holy Spirit and the
Yeah,
unforgivable sin against the Holy Spirit as
yeah, yeah.
well. You know, there's something here. They talk about it a lot in the New Testament, and you know, I think the first thing we have to say is that it is a mystery. Like, we're not 100% sure what it is, to be honest,
Mm,
but we do know that it's a phrase that meant something to the early church. Jesus talks about it in Mark. He talks about it in Luke. When Ananias and Sapphira drop down dead in Acts 5, they are said to have grieved the Holy Spirit. The
mm,
book of Hebrews talks about don't grieve the Holy Spirit. Now, Paul talks about it here in Ephesians. He talks about it elsewhere as well about grieving the Holy Spirit. And it, you know,
mhm.
I feel like there's a thing here. And I don't know, have I talked about it with you guys before? I don't want to sort of totally repeat myself,
No, go ahead. Doesn't matter. Repetition is
but
not bad.
there's a movement in it. So in the Gospels, the sin of grieving the Holy Spirit is a sin that the Pharisees could commit. So it's only the Pharisees could do it. And they
Okay.
essentially are the people who are looking at the work of Jesus, and they kind of look him full in the face and they go, oh yeah, we've seen the lame walk, and we've seen the blind
Mhm.
see, and we've seen the poor being fed and bonds being broken. But you're the devil. You're only doing this because you are devil, or the son of the devil. And
Mhm.
Jesus looks at them and he says, watch out, you've just committed the unforgivable sin, or the sin that is unforgiven, or an eternally unforgiven sin. Do you remember I've talked about this? The idea that the word eternal doesn't mean unforgivable. It means that you have taken yourself out of relationship with eternity. You've
Yeah, okay.
breached. So if you're in a state of eternal forgiveness, then you are in the right relationship to God. And if you take
Yeah,
yourself out of that relationship, you are now in a state of eternal unforgiveness. So it
yeah,
is possible to be back in a right relationship. You can turn from
yeah,
eternal forgiveness to eternal unforgiveness. So
yeah.
anyway, to knock yourself out, and in Jesus's world, to knock yourself out of relationship to the Holy Spirit was to deny him. Okay. And that was a sin that only the Pharisees could commit, the teachers of the law, the people who claimed to know better.
Mhm.
So it wasn't something that like young, dumb people would accidentally commit. It's not for the young and dumb, it's for the old and wise. Okay. Is that's the kind of sin. So you
Mm.
had these Pharisees who had one job, and their one job was to recognize the Holy Spirit when the Holy Spirit starts to move. And they saw the Holy Spirit move and they said, that's Satan. So he said, you've just grieved the Holy Spirit. So now you fast forward, the next time the word grieving the Holy Spirit shows up is in the book of Acts, where Ananias and Sapphira do it, because now they have taken over the role of the Pharisees. They have been part
Mm.
of the early church, the movement of the Holy
Mm.
Spirit. They've
Mm.
watched no poor amongst you. They've watched the deaf being healed. They've watched the poor being released. You know, they are participating in this, and and they lie. So their sin, by the way, is not that they didn't give all their money to the church. That is not their sin. Their sin is that the
Yeah,
money they gave, they kept some back out of self-sufficiency,
yeah,
interestingly, because they
yeah,
basically didn't trust that the church really was going to take care of their needs. So they kind of kept something back, and then they pretended
yeah,
that they'd given everything. And that's when
yeah.
Peter says, you've grieved the Holy Spirit. And it's like they've now become that, they've become the Pharisees now. Like they had one job. They were supposed to recognize the provision and the new creation that's happening with the Holy Spirit in
Mhm.
their presence. And they're still
Mhm.
being self-sufficient. They're still clutching, taking something back.
Yeah, yeah.
So with that in mind, you know, it's like, what's going on here when Paul in Colossians or in Ephesians here, don't grieve the Holy Spirit. And I think it's a sense of like, you are right now, you are participating in new creation, new life.
Mm.
Don't
Mm.
go back to the Gentile way. Don't go back to that old way.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
You know better.
you know better, right? So grieving the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit isn't like I think a lot of young people kind of, you probably had this as well if you've ever been a youth pastor or whatever, where like young people think, have I committed the unforgivable sin? You know,
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, a classic question.
classic question, right? And it isn't about like it's not like words that you say. The unforgivable sin isn't like that you use the wrong words in the wrong order. It's not saying I don't believe you, Jesus Christ. You know, you haven't committed the unforgivable sin.
No.
It's taking yourself out of when you are participating in the life of new creation, and then you
Mm.
deliberately set yourself against it. That's when you're taking
Mm.
yourself out of some sort of relationship, right?
Yeah.
And Paul is very concerned about, it's going to come up again in Ephesians 5. It's going to come up about the body. He's going to talk about, Christ is the head and we're all one body. And so
Yeah.
taking yourself out of that unity is part of what it is to grieve the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, interesting.
Which, by the way, is right back to what you said about sin, being self-assertive, self-concerned.
Yeah. So the various translations, it's interesting. Not one of them, your translation, mine says disappoint the Holy Spirit. The one on Sunday I said it was grieve. This one, New Living Translation, says bring sorrow to the Holy Spirit. I think it's interesting in all of those cases is that there's a sense of emotion. It's interesting. The way that I kind of talked about it on Sunday is there is an emotional reaction that God has when he sees his church breaking, when he sees his children fighting, when he sees his children lying to one another, when he sees his children acting in a way that he didn't want them to act. And it's interesting that as a parent, you want your children to get on. You want your children to, and it does grieve you that if they fall out of relationship. It doesn't just affect their relationship. It affects things like family gatherings and all that kind of stuff. That actually, the family dynamic is affected by sibling, and siblings notoriously struggle to get on with one another. That's a sibling dynamic.
What do you do when you're a parent? I mean, you're grieving. You can see your child making consistently bad choices, as it were, and you're grieving them. How does a good parent act in that situation then? What do you do? Like, what kind of options are open to you then?
Well, I guess the classic option is kind of the authoritarian, disciplinary. Usually the action is something where you're like, please don't do that. These are your consequences. That avenue is, you're grounded, kind of classic avenue. Don't do this. You're grounded. And another would be something along the lines of trying to understand what the motivation is behind it. I think a big part of parenting is enabling someone that has lived a short life to see the long-term implications for decisions that they make, whether that's school or relationships or friendships or whatever, is to be able to say, it's how young people navigate the internet is an example, right? Social media and all that, being able to say, this is the long-term impact. What you do on social media will be essentially there forever. It'd be very hard to, helping them see the long view, helping them see the consequences of these things. And I think, and I think that's essentially what it's somehow navigating I'm going to create a safe place where there are rules and there are boundaries to how we are to be with one another. But I'm also going to say that these rules aren't there for any reason, for no reason. They are there because we are trying to create a space where you can thrive and flourish and make responsible choices. Because actually, if a child is just raised with you shouldn't do this because you shouldn't do this because I said so, it doesn't really help them navigate the real world when they eventually are free to make whatever choices they make. But if they have a rationale and a reasoning behind it that they think, it works, I can see why this works, then I think that's why. And I think my response to this, do not grieve the Holy Spirit, is, and I think it's a helpful picture. Well, it's not just a picture, a helpful way of phrasing what is a reality, which I think we are often immune from or numb to, which is that God has an emotional reaction when his children fight, when his children are in disunity. He is grieved. He feels the loss of that. He feels the pain of that. There is a spiritual implication to our disunity with our Father. That is a sad, unhappy, grieving, sorrowful thing.
Because that's why I brought it up. I was sort of asked. I was like, because I was thinking, thinking about the conflicts that we have whenever there's some conflict, and then our prayers are always essentially looking for some helicopter parent to swoop in and intervene, like, and fix something, like, bend the guns and melt the bullets and all, whatever. And actually, I feel like God's interesting. I feel like Jesus, like, what are you talking about? I already told my followers. I've told you what my followers are supposed to do. You just never do it. But
yeah.
I did intervene. That's what all this cross stuff was about. Like, I did it. I've already intervened. I've already solved war. You just don't want it. You don't want what I'm offering.
Yeah,
Because,
okay.
Hate to break it to you, the Russians are an Orthodox Christian nation, and this is a Christian national war. And the Ukraine is an Orthodox Christian nation, and they are Christian nationalists. And all us Brits and Americans and Canadians who are cheering on one side or the other are also doing it for Christian nationalist reasons. Like, Jesus, I can imagine looking at the whole thing going, I told you, this is this is what, you're killing each other. You're in your anger, you're sinning. You're not laying down your arms. You're not turning the other cheek. None of you are, right? You're not considering others better than yourselves. You are holding up national borders rather than seeking the lost. You're not with the marginal. Like, at every single turn on every single side of this conflict, you are in organized disobedience to my way. And you are calling yourselves Christians at the same time. It's like, what else? What do you want? What do you want? Like,
it's a helpful image, this helicopter.
It's here in Ephesians, kind of like, this is the bed that you are making, and now you're lying in it. We know a better way. And my intervention is to remind you of it and to ask you to start doing it,
Yeah.
We always want that kind of helicopter parent, and then we think that God's
that's a helpful image, because actually one thing in our family, for example, if there's been a disagreement between the siblings, is we ask them to fix it themselves.
Yeah.
You guys, what did you do wrong? What did you do wrong? Can you ask for forgiveness? Can you say sorry? Can you forgive one another? We don't just say, we don't allow, for example, I'm sorry, and the other one says it's okay, because actually sometimes it's not okay if you've been punched in the face. That's not okay.
Exactly.
But you can say, I forgive you. It recognizes that it's not okay. And that's, as parents, we're trying to equip our children to act responsibly in the world as they get older.
I mean,
so God is saying the same thing.
This is all conflict resolution, all of it. So much of this is about how to solve conflicts without killing each other or impoverishing each other. Even the stuff about thieves should work and not steal. That's assuming underneath, first of all, a system in which there's a thief who has to steal to eat. Imagine how wrong it is if you have someone amongst you who's part of your community, and they are so hungry that they have to steal to eat. Shame on you. Shame on the community, first of all. Don't just look at that thief. Why is that thief stealing? Because they're hungry? What is wrong with you? And then, if you want that thief to work properly and have an honest wage, well, who's going to hire them? You are. We're still going to do this. Like, a lot of the conflicts that arise because of the group is not acting the way it should in the first place, right? A lot of the poverty that's coming, a lot of the hunger that's coming, it's because wealthy Christians aren't acting like followers of Jesus. They're acting like pagan Gentiles. And so much of this, even that stuff about thieves and eating, ultimately comes down to unity amongst the brotherhood and a conflict resolution kind of stuff, how to resolve our differences well, Yeah.
So helpful. And we're going to continue that theme into the beginning of chapter 5 as well, more of the same, of how we live out this life. And hopefully what we've done today is set a bit of a stage for that, to talk more about it in the forthcoming weeks. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. Wonderful. We could go on forever, but for the sake of our listeners,
we got a big one coming up next week. All the big one, Ephesians 5.
Yeah. All righty. Well, with that little, with that taster, we'll see you soon. Have a wonderful week. Take care.
Bye.